When you think of Indonesian culture, there is a high chance that you are not thinking about gender identity. If you have not spent much time in the country, there is an equally high chance that you are not aware of it being the home to tertiary gender identities, identities which have traditionally existed outside of a male-female gender binary, or even a 5-gender social system within which our very concepts of male and female do not exist. Over the coming episodes, we will be taking an in-depth look at what gender means for these communities in Indonesia. And for our first episode in this country, we have the honour of learning firsthand from an award-winning, internationally recognised activist about what life is like as not a man, not a woman, but a Waria, living in the heart of Java, Indonesia. Welcome to episode 7 of Slash Queer. You're here with me, your host, Georgie Williams. There are, at this time, 26 different terms used around the world for what we in the West would consider to mean transgender. Etymologically, we can understand how the word transgender means to transition from one gender to another. The applicability of this term in different cultures depends on 2 prerequisites. 1. That an individual is identifying with a gender recognized in the West, and 2. A transition is occurring in the first place. The issue with applying this term to anyone who does not identify as one of these Western conceptions of gender is that this delegitimizes a whole host of other non-Western gender identities which do not meet this criteria. There is, after all, no objective and globally recognized truth behind what makes a person male or female gendered. Maleness and femaleness are culturally subjective, as is what exists outside of those categories. So when identities exist outside this framework, identities which require their own language to describe themselves instead of having language of others imposed upon them, what does that look like? How do we begin to understand them? I have talked in previous episodes about how fortune and opportunity have been on my side during this round-the-world venture as a wannabe queer pioneer, and my experiences in Yogyakarta on the island of Java were no different. It was by reaching out to LGBTQ+ research contacts in Indonesia that I was passed on to another researcher and worker at an NGO in Jogja, who was happy to put me in touch with some interviewees for my episode on Waria culture. As luck would have it, the person who sat opposite me at the table during that first meeting at the NGO was a face I recognized from some 4 years prior. At her behest, I was to spend 3 weeks sharing in the life and labour of award-winning activist and community leader Shinta Ratri. I had never met Shinta before, but back when I was studying my master's degree in gender in 2016, I had taken a unit on the anthropology of kinship, sex, and gender. It was arguably this unit that pushed me down the path of becoming a researcher of transnational gender and sexuality variant culture, and during those first few classes, we learned about Waria in Indonesia. Shinta was, and still is, the face of the Waria rights movement. She is all over the internet, and not long after I completed my degree, I remember reading an article all about her work in the Guardian newspaper. Back in 2008, Shinta established the only Islamic boarding school for Waria and transgender people, Pondok Pesantren Waria Al-Fatah. Shinta and her associates work closely with a local Islamic university, but also facilitate non-Muslim events at a local Christian university, as around 8% of Waria living in Yogyakarta are Christian. The culture of Indonesia cannot be disentangled from religion. Indonesia is the world's most populous Muslim-majority country, with 87.2% of citizens practicing Islam. So, as you will note in my interview here with Shinta, one's relationship with their gender as Waria is so often tied into their relationship with their religion. As we proceed into this interview with Shinta, you are probably asking, what is Waria? What does this term mean? I cannot tell you. All that I feel comfortable telling you is that this is a traditional third gender identity found across much of Indonesia, which is often compared to or translated as the Western concept of a transgender woman. But beyond that, I am deferring exclusively to Shinta to explain this concept, in a bid to decenter myself from this narrative. Indonesia remained under Dutch colonial rule until 1945, and I have talked to a whole host of Indonesians who express discomfort at how Indonesian culture is continually exoticized by outsiders. Nobody needs yet another white tourist's distorted and romanticized perspective. A decolonial practice to telling these stories involves, quite frankly, not making them about me and my worldview. Which is why I am grateful to have Shinta Ratri telling you what the Waria experience looks like. For the following interview, Shinta spoke predominantly in Bahasa Indonesia and was interpreted by NGO worker Astrid Febrianti. So if you have any issues following it, please refer to the transcript available on the /queer website. Shinta, how did you start doing this work? What is your story?
Sudah sejak lama, jadi ketika saya masih kuliah tahun 81, karena basic saya itu berorganisasi, kemudian saya melihat kawan-kawan Waria ini hanya nongkrong-nongkrong saja. Saya bersama kawan saya yang juga punya background pendidikan yang di akademi, kemudian membuat Ikatan Waria Yogyakarta pada tahun 82. Jadi itu adalah kira-kira 38 tahun yang lalu. Jadi 38 tahun yang lalu saya memulai advokasi ini melalui Ikatan Waria Yogyakarta. Pada waktu itu isunya masih hanya di bidang kesenian dan kesejahteraan saja. Pada waktu itu belum ada tentang penyakit AIDS, tentang penyakit kelamin, belum ada. Tetapi kemudian ketika kita mulai bergabung dengan PKBI, kita mulai menambahkan isu yaitu IMS. Ya, IMS itu infeksi penyakit menular seksual. Infeksi menular. Ya, kemudian kita bersama-sama dengan difasilitasi oleh PKBI, kita mulai mengembangkan bagaimana Waria itu melakukan perjuangan identitas. Jadi kami memperjuangkan identitas dan membangkitkan kesadaran kritisnya kawan-kawan. Pada waktu itu belum ada yang namanya LGBT. Jadi the first struggling in identity is from trans woman, and no gay, no lesbian, not yet. Jadi kemudian ketika mulai isu HIV/AIDS, di mana isu HIV/AIDS itu secara global dengan funding internasional, disitulah kita mulai bergabung menjadi bagian dari LGBT. Jadi disitulah satu sisi perjuangan Waria ini sudah menempatkan diri di dalam track yang benar. Jadi bagaimana kemudian kami memperjuangkan identitas Waria di tengah masyarakat, di tengah penerimaan di pemerintah ataupun di agama gitu. Tetapi kemudian ketika bergabung di dalam LGBT, kemudian seolah-olah ini langkah mundur, artinya perjuangan kami mulai dari awal lagi. We start from the beginning because we in the part of the LGBT people. Ya. Kemudian ketika tahun 2006 2000.
That was so long. Okay, so basically, she started this in college a while back in college in 1981. She's basically doing some organizations thingy with her friend, and she's transgender, or we call it as a Waria. They see it as, why do they hang around? Why don't they have their own community? Why don't they just be one? She and her friend that has an academical background created this Waria community for like 38 years ago, 38 tahun yang lalu. The discussion was, at first, the discussions was only about art and also their own well-being. But after joining PKBI, or how do you say that in English? Yeah, basically this organization that focus on health reproductions. They talk about transmitted disease. They're also talking about the kind of disease that was likely going to happen in all kind of gender that exists, and also touch about reproductions also for Waria and stuff. And when they learn about transmitted disease with PKBI, they're like bandwagoning them also with the development to fight for their own identity alongside with PKBI. And right now, and before all this LGBT stuff happens inside Indonesia, the one who fight for it first is the transgender people, or the trans people, or the Waria. And before the terms of LGBT exist in Indonesia, they're the one who first came up with these struggles. They're the one who created this organizations, their community, and they're the only one fighting for this identity before LGBT terms comes in and become an issues. And let's say just they're the first one who came up with this whole issues and make the discussions happen inside of the Indonesian society. And at the times when HIV is globally known, that's where the fund from international community comes to their trans community, which is the boarding schools. That's why they're being funded by international schools. They're also being associated with LGBT, but they think that LGBT has created a step back for their own organizations because she say that doesn't want to be part of the LGBT.
No, ya. Kemudian tahun 2008 kami mendirikan pondok pesantren Waria. Jadi tujuannya untuk memberikan ruang nyaman bagi kawan-kawan Waria untuk beribadah. Di sinilah kami memperjuangkan hak beribadahnya buat kawan-kawan Waria sampai sekarang. Dan disitulah kami kemudian tidak hanya memperjuangkan hak beribadah, tetapi juga kita berjuang di dalam ranah sosial seperti bakti sosial, seperti Ghost to Campus, seperti mendidik masyarakat untuk mengetahui bahwa Waria itu apa, siapa, mengapa gitu. Kemudian kami juga mengadvokasi pemerintah supaya pemerintah ini memberikan hak yang sama kepada Waria seperti warga negara yang lain. Itu.
So basically in 2008, she started to make this boarding school of Waria or transgender. It is basically to fight for their right to pray and also stay in their religion, even if they're part of their own religion. Sometimes it was not being acknowledged. That's why she fights for their right to be accepted at least. They also go to a social service and goes to campus to socialize about the Waria issues and other kind of issues to make the understanding better towards all the society around it.
For context, the PKBI or PKBI is the reproductive rights NGO where Shinta and I met. The services provided by the NGO are run out of a gallery space there. One of the workers explained to me that in Indonesian culture, when you first greet someone, you often ask them if they've eaten, and secondly, you ask "Mau kau mana?", which translates to "Where are you going?" The NGO worker explained to me that although this is often intended to convey concern and care for an individual, it can also double as an act of surveillance. For individuals wishing to access gendered or sexual services, going to a gallery is safer than going to a clinic. I want to understand why it is that the Waria community might not want to be associated with the LGBT community, and also how being Waria is different to being transgender.
Transgender itu sama, jadi Waria itu adalah trans woman. Jadi kenapa kemudian kami ini ketika dalam pada saat-saat tertentu kami tidak mau digabungkan di dalam LGBT, karena secara identitas itu juga berbeda, bahwasanya kami ini adalah bukan bentuk jadi kalau Waria ini lebih diterima di masyarakat. Jadi untuk perjuangan kami lebih mudah, karena kamu tahu sendiri bahwa di masyarakat di Indonesia itu agama masih dipegang erat, dan ya ketika kemudian kita berjuang dengan LGBT itu penolakan itu lebih keras, ya. Itu satu. Yang kedua,
so basically the reason why they don't want to be associated is first is that they say that the transgender is same, but they want to be Waria is a trans woman. And in certain times the reason why they don't want to be associated with LGBT is because identity based is different, and Indonesian society is like really strong and really uphold their religions. That's why in this kind of terms, trans woman or Waria is likely to be accepted in comparisons to LGBT. So they had a different start because, the issues was come out first for Waria, and later on there's LGBT. So that's why they have this different starting point that makes it harder if the trans women are associated with LGBT. But basically that.
Okay, so it's more about how the Waria community was already established.
Yeah, there beforehand, before the LGBT. That's why they don't want to they wouldn't want to be associated with LGBT because they're really being rejected by Indonesian society because of the religion issues, and they also done a government advocacy towards trans women specifically.
Ya, tapi itu hanya dalam tidak selalu. Jadi itu pada saat-saat tertentu saja kita memisahkan diri dari LGBT, tergantung bagaimana kita sedang memperjuangkan apa gitu. Kalau pada dasarnya ya, kalau sekarang ini mau tidak mau ya, itu ya terpaksa kita tergabung di dalam LGBT itu karena isu global ya. Ya gitu.
Oh, so basically it's not always they disassociate themselves with the LGBT. Basically it's based on the issues they want to talk about. So sometimes there's issues specifically for trans women. That's why they want to fight for their own. But now in the current status quo, because of the global tense about LGBT, they are it's not forced. It's like they need to bandwagon with the LGBT because the issues are more spread, and basically it's happening right now in society, and they decided to sometimes bandwagon the movement of LGBT.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, it's kind of that the specific needs and focuses of the Waria community need to not be absorbed by the LGBT community, that there are individual experiences that aren't represented by other LGBT individuals that need a focus with regards to kind of activism and advocacy. Is that correct?
Yeah, true.
Okay. My final question is, how can communities outside of the Waria community and outside of Indonesia support you and this social movement?
Perjuangan kami itu memang membutuhkan bantuan, apalagi tentang peningkatan kapasitas di dalam pengorganisasian, di dalam perjuangan tentang safe and security-nya, kemudian di dalam di dalam melakukan kegiatan-kegiatan yang sifatnya untuk penguatan untuk penerimaan masyarakat. Soalnya kamu tahu sendiri bahwasanya Waria ini adalah sesuatu yang paling visible di antara komponen LGBT. Ketika isu LGBT itu dipakai oleh politician untuk menaikkan elektabilitas, jadi kemudian yang paling pertama menerima dampak buruk adalah kami, adalah Waria. Itulah kenapa safe and security di dalam kegiatan itu kami utamakan. Nah, kalau bantuan yang bisa diharapkan adalah bantuan bagaimana kita bisa tetap eksis melakukan kegiatan sambil menjaga keamanannya, dan itu bisa langsung saja datang ke organisasi kemudian melihat kebutuhan apa yang kami perlukan gitu, terutama untuk shelter rumah aman, kemudian shelter untuk waria-waria lansia gitu. Itu yang sangat kami butuhkan.
Okay. So basically, what they need help the most is that improving their capacity, especially in organization strategies, if it's about campaign and stuff, and also about safe and security in them when they're doing campaign. And because they've also done a lot of activity about how to make a society acceptance around them, that's why they really need help in terms of safe and security from other kind of organizations that may help. Example given like PKBI, that's why they're always trying to strengthen their movement in terms of organizational strategies. And currently, since trans women is the most visible form of LGBT, most likely they're the one who kind of get the first impact the moment when there's a bad issues about that. And likely is that in the current issues that LGBT are used by politicians to increase their approval rate, and most likely the one who get the bad impact when the politician did something bad, or the one who in the front line who will defend them all, the one who get the first hate and everything is the trans woman in all itself. That's why they also need help in terms of safe and security from any kind of organizations that are likely to help them. And they also need especially a safety during their own campaign, because somehow there's always a lot of hates. And if some people or some organization or any kind of stakeholders that likely want to help, they can just come towards their own boarding schools and see what they really need there. They will explain to you. And currently what they needed the most is a shelter, especially a shelter for people who's old, trans women, elderly. Yeah,
Of course.
That's what they really need right now.
Yeah, elderly, because the elderly people, why they very need to help, because they don't have a job, they have weakness, and around society not have much the money to care all of the elderly people, to rent the house and to food like this.
One afternoon during my 3 weeks with Shinta, she invited me over to her boarding school. Riding on the back of Shinta's motorbike, her handbag still on her arm as we wove through the traffic, she invited me to attend the signing of a memorandum of understanding with the Indonesian government to secure particular protections and local governmental support for Waria. These protections are long overdue, as in 2016, Shinta was forced to temporarily close the school after continued threats of violence towards herself and her fellow Waria by a local Muslim fundamentalist group. Having reached out to the police for protection, Shinta had been encouraged to create some form of dialogue with the fundamentalists. This dialogue proved unsuccessful, and Shinta and the Al-Fatah boarding school were further targeted by locals who began to deliberately misgender and harass her and other Waria. 2016 was a year when an unprecedented rise in conservative politics swept the nation, and Shinta's meeting with Indonesian government representatives was a means through which to secure the protections they needed to survive another wave of far-right resurgence if it happened again. Shinta's work is never done. When she wasn't negotiating with government officials, she was personally funding blood tests for Waria at the boarding school, ensuring that those at high risk of disease were being checked by nurses from the local hospital once every 3 months. Many Waria struggle to secure employment due to gender discrimination, which leads them to turn to sex work. Of course, this is never an easy choice, and many who do so struggle to balance their identities as a sex worker and as a practicing Muslim. Shinta does her utmost to support them, as she is under no illusions that many Waria simply do not have another choice. That said, she does also personally fund visits from makeup artists and hairstylists, who train Waria in these fields so that they can at least have a chance at leaving sex work and gaining employment elsewhere, if they so desire. There is a reason Shinta was awarded the Frontline Defenders Award for the protection of human rights last year. She has devoted her whole life and everything she has to protecting her fellow Waria, people who live on the absolute breadline without external help. My final question is there anything else that you want to share? My audience is mostly UK and US based, but is there anything that you think they should know in order to be more supportive and understanding?
Ada lagi yang mau disampaikan?
Ya, kami ini punya mimpi untuk kan ada sekitar 30 Waria di Jogja itu sekitar yang umurnya 55 ke atas, dan kami itu mimpi mereka itu bisa punya kesejahteraan di hari tuanya. Jadi kami ingin mengumpulkan mereka itu setiap bulan untuk selama 2 hari. Nah, selama 2 hari inilah kita bisa melakukan sesuatu, yaitu di dalam 2 hari ini ada pemeriksaan kesehatan, kemudian pemeriksaan psikologisnya, kemudian kita beri siraman rohani, kemudian kita kasih kegiatan-kegiatan hiburan kayak bercocok tanam, kemudian hobi lah, kegiatan yang hobi, kemudian kita kasih senam lansia, kemudian yang paling utama adalah kemudian kita kasih bantuan uang untuk sewa rumah, dan kita kasih satu paket makanan bergizi. Itu yang sedang menjadi mimpi saya yang ingin saya wujudkan itu. Jadi kita mengumpulkan 30 orang yang nanti selama setiap bulan kita kumpulkan itu.
Okay, so they had a dream for 20 trans women that exist in the current boarding school that age above 55, to have their own well-being and also their own social security to survive when they're still alive. And they want to they actually want to have an event together them in 2 days to have their own health check-up, and also their own check-up in terms of psychologies and also their own mental health issues. And also, since this is a boarding school for religion space, they also want to have a spiritual closure towards them where they also need it, and a bit of a warm up for them. It's one of the activities that they want to have fun together, and also doing their own hobby based on their own liking, their own interests, so that they can be, enjoying their own, old ages. That's why but the most important thing, the things that they want to prioritize is, in the end, they want to give a help in terms of money and finances and monetary fund for them to pay for the rent, and also have their own nutrition in terms of food. That's what they will need the most in terms of fun.
The experience of not identifying as one's assigned gender at birth is so often presumed to be a new and Western concept. The existence of Waria disproves that. Shinta has been openly Waria and aware of the Waria community since she was in university, and she is now in her late 50s. research yields articles claiming that to be Waria is to be a third gender which has no Western equivalent, and this is what I myself believed prior to meeting and working with Shinta. In Bahasa Indonesia, the word for woman is wanita, and the word for man is pria. Waria is a combination of the two. Shinta often compares being Waria to being a trans woman, and although I have liaised with workers at the PKBI who informed me that this comparison seems to be a means of translating the Waria experience into terms that Westerners can understand, it is not my place, or any non-Waria individuals, to question the alignment of these two terms. What is evident is that Waria continue to call themselves Waria, not just trans women. That distinction is important, not only for the sake of cultural sensitivity, but also for ensuring that the gendered histories of Indonesia are not absorbed and erased under the imposition of Western language. After all, before the term transgender was even coined in 1965, Waria existed, congregated, and created communities together here in Indonesia. I am fortunate enough now to be able to call Shinta Ratri my friend. At one point during our discussions of her work, I asked Shinta if, aside from any of the occasional charity and NGO funding, if she received donations through any kind of crowdfunding service. She did not. There was, in fact, no program or campaign in place to collect donations for Shinta and her boarding school. Shinta offered so much to the /Queer project in the time I had with her, and since my departure she has informed me that she has been working to provide safety and security for more vulnerable Waria, particularly elderly Waria and those without a safe place to shelter during the coronavirus outbreak. Expanding the boarding school to keep these people safe is no mean feat, and she is doing it with very little external support. So, if you feel like donating to Shinta and her incredibly important cause, you can visit /queer.com/funding and donate directly to Shinta. The Indonesian rupiah is not a strong currency compared to British pounds and American dollars. You won't believe how far your spare change will go in Indonesia, especially when it is paying for bare essentials like food, water, and medical services. It goes without saying that this is undeniably a deserving cause, where measurable change is taking place. Your donations would be met with gratitude. As my time in Yogyakarta drew to a close, Shinta and I unveiled our joint exhibition at the gallery in the NGO where we met 3 weeks prior. Identitas Kam Pinggiran, which translates loosely to Identities at the Margins, was an exchange of sorts. Shinta showcased photographs and stories of the day-to-day life of the Waria community, and I shared transcriptions from previous /Queer episodes, translated into Bahasa Indonesia. During the opening ceremony, Shinta asked me many questions about the transcripts and informed me that hearing about alternately gendered experiences outside of Indonesia was important for Waria. And although one can appreciate this, the inverse feels important and overlooked. Understanding the international, transnational multiplicity of gender identity is essential if we are to deconstruct this idea of gender and sexuality variance as something that is white and Eurocentric. It is not about putting communities like Waria on a pedestal as exotic, unusual, and controversial. It is about demonstrating that expecting a gender binary to exist everywhere as a default is culturally ignorant. Gender identity is not a trend, nor a fashion. It is an inexpungible facet of the human experience. Shinta's story is one that deserves to be heard, one of many that demonstrates that what makes us unique does not have to isolate us. No matter where you go in the world, you will find people who exist outside of the socially determined norm. And in spite of bigotry, hostility, and aggression, they thrive. The struggle of Waria for their rights and freedoms is far from over. But there is a drive and determination there that cannot be extinguished. We could all stand to learn from the unyielding fortitude and indomitable spirit of the Waria. This episode of the /Queer podcast was edited by Sam Clay and scripted and produced by me, Georgie Williams. A very special thanks to Bo Newham, Jamie Newland, Astrid Febrianti, and, of course, Ibu Shinta Ratri. Once again, I would like to ask my listeners to consider donating to Shinta's cause. In the current pandemic, the needs of those that live at the margins of society, such as the Waria of Yogyakarta, are being overlooked. You can find the link to donate to Shinta at slashqueer.com/fundraising. Your money will go a long, long way in Indonesia, and even your loose change can make a difference. I want to take a quick moment to thank my Patreon subscribers, whose pledges are helping make this project happen. I feel immense gratitude for your generosity, and you should take pride in the fact that your contributions are allowing these important stories to be shared around the world. If you're not a Patreon, and fancy lobbing a few pennies my way every month, you can find the Slashqueer Patreon at patreon.com/queer. That's SLASH queer. The link is also available on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages. Every time a new patron signs up, I get quite obscenely emotional, so know that anything you can give means the world to myself and the rest of the team. This episode was recorded on location in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. Music in this episode was composed by Kevin MacLeod. If you enjoyed this episode or have any feedback, please get in touch on Instagram or Twitter at @slashqueer, or email us at slashqueer@outlook.com. Perhaps now more than ever, stay kind, stay radical, and stay queer.